Japan's economy is in ruin. National and public debt levels are at an all-time high. The country's population is in a state of steady decline, and Japan's battle with deflation has been going on for decades now. No matter how you look at it, Japan's economy is in a fragile position. The slightest financial blow could cause it to crash completely. Will Japan hold its ground on the global economic landscape, or will it collapse? Keep watching to find out. The beginning of trouble. Japan's economy is in a devastating position right now. Contrary to what we know about the Japanese financial landscape today, this would have been unfathomable a few decades ago. During the 1980s, Japan's economic power was on full display. Back in the day, you couldn't buy anything without being reminded of the country's financial might. From DVD players to cars, motorcycles, and technology, Japanese industries were thriving. Brands such as Sony, Toshiba, Panasonic, Hitachi, and Sharp became household names. Not only that, but this was the time when Japanese entertainment took the world by storm. It won't be much of a stretch to say today that Japan revolutionized global pop culture. The world was not prepared for the influx of Japanese animated entertainment. From Pokemon, Mario Brothers, and Pac-Man, the Japanese certainly knew how to catch our attention. It wasn't only Japanese entertainment that had the world mesmerized, it was the booming economy too. At one point during the 80s, analysts even predicted that Japan would surpass the US in GDP. From being a rising superstar on the economic front to drowning in debt, the question begs to be asked, what went wrong? The answer, as always, isn't as simple as you'd expect. To better understand the fragile state of the Japanese economy today, we need to turn back time. Although Japan's economy was thriving a few decades ago, you can see the germs of its later financial problems present even then. But for now, let's go back to the beginning, which, for our purposes, starts right after the Second World War. The Rising Phoenix. After the horrors of the Second World War, Japan was in utter ruin. To put it simply, Japan used to be the polar opposite of what it is today. Japan's population was starving, and the economy was almost completely destroyed. After the ravages of the war, Japan struggled to get back onto its feet. In a rather interesting turn of events, Japan's economic resurrection happened because of another war. This time it was the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Allies turned adversaries, the two nations maneuvered around each other during the late 1940s. By the early 1950s, battle lines were being redrawn. Things came to a head in 1953. Forces from the north of Korea invaded the south, and for a while, it looked as though they would capture Seoul. Just before things got out of hand, the US intervened. On the one side, North Korea allied with the Soviet Union. On the other side, South Korea stood with the US. Whenever there's a war, both sides need a steady stream of supplies. At first, the US shipped its supplies from the United States, but this proved to be extremely inefficient. Not only were there supply chain disturbances, but the process sucked up a huge amount of money. It was at this point that the US turned to Japan for help. The US's increased demand for munition and other resources gave the Japanese economy the kickstart that it so desperately needed. From the ashes of economic ruin, Japan rose. Not only did the US demand for munition revitalize the economy, but also laid the foundation for what was to come next. In the decades that followed, Japan would establish itself as an industrial giant. Eventually, it would even pose a threat to the US. All things considered, this is a tad ironic, seeing how it was the US that resurrected the Japanese economy. Once the Japanese economy had gotten out of the danger zone, Prime Minister Hayato Akita focused on integrating Japan's economy with global markets. In the 1950s, the Japanese turned their attention to heavy industrialization. By the 1980s, Japan was unstoppable, a growing economic powerhouse on its way to becoming the world's biggest economy. The trouble started in 1979. Although the problems in Japan's economic model wouldn't be evident until much later, it was here that they began to truly germinate. 1979, as some viewers might already be aware, was the year of the second oil crisis. Prices of oil skyrocketed, and there were global fuel shortages. Major players on the global economic front were heavily reliant on oil imports, and as a result, their economies stumbled. In an attempt to cope with the changes brought on by the second oil crisis, industrialized nations lowered their interest rates. The Bank of Japan lowered its interest rates too. This laid the groundwork for one of the biggest asset bubbles of all time to occur. As with all asset bubbles, Japan's economy in the 80s was healthy and thriving. An asset bubble depends on several factors which act as fuel to keep the bubble expanding. In Japan's case, this fuel came in the form of lowered interest rates. There was also the supply of money and credit in the right sectors. For Japan's economy, the 80s became a symbolic time of unprecedented growth. The reason behind this was fueling the asset bubble as much as they could. This meant creating credit and supplying money to lucrative economic sectors. Unlike most Western central banks, the Bank of Japan found a very creative way to create credit. Their strategy was simple, yet highly effective. The Bank of Japan created quotas for certain industries. These quotas were implemented through the country's largest banks. This technique, referred to retrospectively as window guidance, helped skyrocket Japanese industries. To put into perspective how monumental Japan's growth was during this time, consider this. Japan's car manufacturing industry posed a huge threat to the U.S. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan limited the number of Japanese car imports. And in 1983, he placed 45% tariffs on Japanese motorcycles. These tariffs were placed in an attempt to save the American Harley-Davidson. After the Plaza Accords of 1985, Japan began to sell its dollar reserves. As a result, the yen started to rise against the dollar. Imports became cheaper. Unknowingly fueling the asset bubble even more, the Bank of Japan lowered interest rates even further. Property and stock prices shot through the roof. At the height of the asset bubble, the small patch of land holding Kyoto Palace had the same valuation as California. Japanese investments flooded the world. Soon after, Tokyo became famous as the party capital of the world. But this economic growth could not go on forever. In 1989, the Bank of Japan began to raise interest. It was clear that this was the beginning of the end. The asset bubble had finally burst. Japan's debt crisis. The first signs of economic stagnation appeared in the form of debt deflation. Debt deflation refers to an economic state where prices are lowered, but interest and debt remain fixed. This, in turn, leads to increased pressure on people to repay their loans. As deflation continues, it becomes even more difficult to repay debt. Spending also decreases during debt deflation. People begin to save their money instead. The only way to break out of the vicious cycle of debt deflation is for central banks to lower interest. For Japan, interest was lowered in 1991. At that point, it was too little and could do nothing to prevent the economy from slumping. Ever since the 90s, Japan's debt crisis has been a persistent problem. Today, Japan's public debt is 50% more than its annual economic output. The repercussions of the asset bubble of the 80s are felt today. Often referred to as the lost decade, the 90s saw Japan in shambles. The real estate and stock markets crashed, creating ripple effects in the economic landscape. By the time the 21st century rolled around, things weren't looking much better for Japan. One major threat was China. With China open for global trade, Japan realized that it could no longer compete in international markets. In blunt words, China had a far greater manufacturing capacity than Japan ever did. Japan's population crisis. Amidst the debt crisis and the collapse of the stock market, Japan faced yet another issue. It had an aging population, which strained the labor force. China's massive workforce is composed of young and eager individuals. Japan had to put up with an older population who needed economic support. Japan's population crisis is one of the major problems that it faces today. People are dying at a much faster rate than they're being born. The latest data on Japan's population paints a concerning picture. In 2022, the number of deaths was double the number of births. According to some estimates, there's been a decrease of 800,000 in the previous year. This marks the most significant population decline since 1968. Since the 90s, successive Japanese governments have been aware of the declining population. Despite attempts at solutions, the rate of decline has surpassed everyone's expectations. In 2017, the National Institute of Population and Social Security Research in Tokyo predicted that the annual number of births would not drop below 800,000 until 2030. Japan has already reached that number this year. Prime Minister Kishida sounded an alarm in January. First of all, he acknowledged that Japan was teetering on the edge of a crisis. His government pledged a budget of around 20 trillion yen to support young couples aspiring to have more children. This amount equates to roughly 4% of Japan's GDP, nearly double the allocation for the same purpose in the previous fiscal year. At this point, you could almost taste Japan's desperation. In late July of this year, Kishida organized an event in Tokyo to launch a nationwide campaign focused on aiding children and families. The efficacy of these policies is a cause for debate. The Japanese government has its economic interest at heart, but there are other factors at work here. One major concern is the decreasing rate of marriages in Japan. People tend to marry later in life and opt for fewer children, mainly due to financial constraints. This brings us back to square one. The dire state of the Japanese economy is also connected to the population crisis. It's a vicious cycle that further stagnates both the population and the economy. Is there any hope at all? Simon Kuznets said that there are 4 types of economies in the world. There are developed economies and underdeveloped economies, and then there's Japan. This goes to show how unpredictable the Japanese economy is. In recent years, the country has experienced some economic growth. Some experts see this as the dawn of a new era. What do you think the future of Japan's economy looks like? As always, we'll be reporting how this situation plays out. Let us know your takes in the comments section. And thanks for watching! Make sure to keep an eye out for our next video.